You stand before a door that should not make a sound, yet it hums softly, like paper remembering its own words. The marble corridor around you carries the hush of centuries. Dust drifts, heavy with the musk of forgotten ink. Every few feet, a faint vibration travels through the floor, like a heartbeat under stone. Somewhere beyond this point lies what scholars call the Apostolic Archive, though those who have glimpsed its innermost vaults whisper another name, the Vault of Silence. You were not meant to come here, not tonight, not with the echo of the city fading above your head. Yet the hum drew you, like a pulse calling from beneath the world. The corridor narrows, its light thinning into colorless twilight. Brass plaques mark shelves of manuscripts, volume numbers, papal decrees, chronicles of crusades. But the sequence falters. Between two numbers 412 and 414, there is nothing. A blank stretch of wall, smooth as polished bone. You reach out, beneath your palm, a tremor, delicate as breathing. The air tastes metallic, as though a storm had passed through centuries ago and never quite left. Someone once wrote that silence is not absence, but a form of protection. The Vatican understood this better than anyone. Not everything can be destroyed. Some truths, once uttered, echo too long to be burned. They must be sealed, walled within soundproof stone, left to vibrate until the world forgets the language they spoke. What hums behind this wall is one of those truths. A prophecy once recited, then erased. Its author, scribe, called Ezra, exiled and returned, who stitched together the law after Babylon's ashes cooled. He is remembered for order, for rebuilding what was broken. But the rumor that clings to this vault tells of another text, one he never meant for the temple nor the crowd, his final ink. You trace the missing number 413 and the wall seems to exhale. Cold air slips from an invisible seam, brushing your wrist. Somewhere deep within the marble, machinery hums, modern guardians of ancient fear. The archive breathes, not with holiness, but with containment. Scholars above will say, this missing shelf is an error in cataloging, a clerical miscount. Yet numbers do not forget. Numbers are cages built for memory. When one disappears, it is not by mistake. The hum steadies, deeper now, like the opening chord of a chant buried beneath the floor. You imagine the vault belows of iron boxes, lights dimmed to protect parchment that remembers the first handwriting of faith. Beneath each lock lies a piece of history too potent to be held in daylight. Among them, it is said, rests a manuscript without title, bound in leather that smells faintly of ash. Its spine carries no mark, its catalogue entry excised from the ledgers. They call it the Vision of Ezra, a prophecy so detailed that even kings feared its arithmetic. Not beasts or numbers, but signs the rhythm of an ending so specific that no crown could outlast it. When it surfaced in rumor, it was not declared heresy, it was declared impossible. And the church learned long ago that impossibility is best stored in silence. You imagine the priests who sealed it centuries ago, hands trembling, not from disbelief, but from recognition. They must have read enough to know that the text spoke too plainly, that it did not promise redemption, only reflection, that it ended not with salvation, but with a mirror. They closed the cover, extinguished the lamps, and signed their names beneath a single phrase. Non distructa, sed secludita, not destroyed, but set apart. The hum thickens into tone. You cannot tell if it comes from behind the wall or within your own chest. A vibration that seems to remember a voice. Somewhere beneath you, a chain of vaults and staircases holds a book that was meant to tell time itself when to stop. You take a step back, the the sound fading into the distance, but its echo stays. The wall before you is still blank, yet the numbering above it refuses to lie. Between 412 and 414, there must always be something. A void precisely measured, a door that hums, and in that space of silence, you begin to understand. This story will not unfold through discovery, but through the things that are missing, through absences mapped like constellations, through pages that refuse to die quietly. You are not entering a legend. You are entering an omission. Above you, the clock tower tolls midnight, and each strike sounds softer than the last, as if the hours themselves are being erased. The hum settles into the marrow of the stone. Somewhere in the dark, a file waits, misnumbered but alive. You turn away, though every instinct tells you not to, but the silence follows. It always does. The first breath of the vault is dry, older than dust, older than fire. You descend narrow stairs that coil beneath the marble, the light thinning with every turn. There are no windows, only the soft luminescence of preservation lamps, their glow filtered through gauze to keep parchment from fading. The air feels heavy, almost intentional, as though the centuries themselves have conspired to slow you. Somewhere in this labyrinth, a single desk waits its surface, scarred with small crescents from quills long turned to bone. You run a finger along its edge, and it flakes beneath your touch, a brittle memory. Upon it lies an open codex, not the prophecy, but the kind of book used by monks to copy names and dates, the scaffolding of faith. Between the neat columns of Latin, an irregularity, one line, darker, slower, written as if the hand that moved had suddenly remembered pain. It reads only, in the margin, the world will end. The ink, still faintly metallic, could be Ezra's, or someone who believed they were continuing him. But belief, here, is indistinguishable from contamination. This vault holds hundreds of partial manuscripts, fragments of thought grafted onto scripture like phantom limbs. And yet, every scribe who ever claimed lineage to Ezra wrote the same phrase differently, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a relief. The end, it seems, was never about fire. It was about reflection. You imagine him, the exiled scribe, sitting by candlelight, the empire behind him already ash. His hands tremble, not from age, but from the weight of what he is about to set down. He does not write of beasts or trumpets, nor of vengeance or thunder. He writes in the language of measures, harvests that yield hunger, sounds that carry no voice, cities that forget why they were built. Each image is precise, balanced like a psalm turned inside out. The prophecy is not a map of destruction. It is an anatomy of forgetting. Ezra dips his quill again. The ink smells of iron and rain. Between each line, he leaves space wide enough for silence to breathe. Scholars call this negative space. Mystics call it the echo of God. When the scroll is finished, he lifts it toward the candle flame, and the gold edge flickers like a blade. Then, with deliberate care, he writes a final phrase at the bottom margin, a line no one was meant to read. That line has never been found. It is said that in later centuries, priests sought to reproduce the text, but each copy failed at the same point. The words beyond the fourth sign refused to stay inked. Pens broke, parchment tore, the letters dissolved into stains shaped like tears. One chronicler described it as if the page itself resisted the weight of completion, as if to write the end was to invite it. You move deeper, past shelves labeled in Latin abbreviations. Between them, you catch glimpses of bindings cracked with salt, edges curled from centuries of humidity. Some covers are stitched shut with thread the color of blood, others left open, their pages frozen mid-sentence. The floor hums faintly again, reminding you that somewhere below this labyrinth, a sealed room still holds what Ezra's quill began. At the corner of the chamber stands a display case of glass so thick it bends light. Inside, a single slip of parchment floats upon velvet, pinned beneath glass. The caption plate is blank. The ink upon the parchment is faded, but under the right angle, you can still see a few surviving words. Written in a script older than Latin, "The fifth shall not be spoken, for it already speaks." Your reflection wavers on the glass, merging with the ancient text until you cannot tell where your face ends and the letters begin. You realize why they feared this prophecy, not for its accuracy, but for its inversion. It does not predict what the world will do. It reveals what the world already is. Behind you, the air shifts. Perhaps it is the venting of old ducks, or perhaps the vault sighing in recognition. You step back and the reflection splits your shadow and the scribes, overlapping in the dim light. The thought arrives uninvited, that Ezra never saw himself as prophet, only as mirror, that every prophecy is a reflection written before its reader exists. The hum deepens, not from walls this time, but from within the ink itself, as if the molecules are rehearsing memory. You close your eyes, and the 5 signs unspool in darkness like threads of a forgotten melody. Fields abundant, yet mouths still hungry. A trumpet whose silence divides nations. Cities of iron knowledge, rusting from within. A generation unremembered, names dissolved in noise. And the 5th, the quietest, a book that reads whoever dares to read it. You open your eyes. The parchment lies still. The reflection is gone. In the distance, a door closes with the soft finality of a candle being pinched out. You think of Ezra's last ink, still humming somewhere behind another wall, waiting for the next hand, brave or foolish enough to touch it. The prophecy is not lost. It is merely listening, waiting for the world to speak the words it already knows. You turn toward the stairs, though you can't remember climbing them down. The hum fades again, but the silence that follows feels thicker, alive. As you rise toward the faint grey of daylight, one thought follows you like a shadow that refuses to obey the sun. Maybe the 5th sign was never written because it was never meant to be read. Maybe it was meant to be lived. The sunlight should have greeted you when you emerged, yet Rome's morning feels dimmer than it should. The sky has the pallor of old vellum, and the bells of St. Peter's toll without resonance, as if the sound itself has been absorbed into the stone. You walk through narrow alleys where shadows cling to frescoes, the smell of rain and incense twining together. Every corner feels half forgotten, every face too modern to belong. And yet beneath the ordinary hum of life you sense the same vibration that lived behind the marble wall. History, you think, is not written in straight lines. It bleeds through centuries, fading in some, resurfacing in others. And between the 12th and 14th centuries, what scholars call the redacted age, the ink itself began to disappear. In monasteries from Avignon to York, librarians found entire sections of scripture gone pale. Letters eaten not by time or moths, but by something else, something deliberate. Catalogue numbers skipped. The margins of chronicles were scraped smooth. Parchment, too precious to waste, was rewritten with safer stories, psalms about obedience, treatises on geometry, prayers that promised order. But beneath the new ink, under certain light, faint shadows of older words bled through, ghostly and insistent. You've seen the reproductions, ultraviolet photographs of palimpsests, where sentences long buried pulse back to life in blue and violet flame. In one fragment, between 2 hymns about divine mercy, a phrase reappears, for even silence keeps record. At first, scholars blamed coincidence. Then they began to notice a pattern. The missing portions aligned across Europe, whole chapters excised in the same decades, all mentioning a book of the fifth sign, a vision of Ezra, or a scroll that watches. The erasures were too neat, the absences too uniform to be decay. It was as if someone had declared war not on heresy, but on memory itself. The chroniclers of the time wrote in euphemisms, librorum, purgatio, the cleansing of books. One abbot recorded that certain texts were removed, for they called men to count the years of the end. In another monastery, a note in the margin reads simply, "Better a blank than a curse." You pause near a fountain older than the basilica. Its basin is cracked, filled with petals and coins. The water trickles thinly, barely alive. You realize that erasure has its own aesthetic. It is clean, sterile, a perfection of absence. Perhaps that was the intention, to replace terror with stillness, chaos with blankness. The Vatican, even then, understood that silence could be an instrument sharper than fire. In the archives of Avignon, a story survives of a scribe named Matteo de. He was tasked with copying the Chronicle of Apostles, yet his copies included a line no other version contained. The world is not ending, it is forgetting itself. For this, he was stripped of his office. His original manuscript was scraped clean, the surface reused for an account of crop yields. Centuries later, when scientists examined the page under infrared light, Matteo's line returned like a vein of iron through limestone. Perhaps erasure was never complete. Perhaps the act of removing memory only deepened it, pressing it like a fossil into deeper strata of paper. Each layer of scraping made the old text stronger, more stubborn. Each silence became an archive of its own. You pass a small chapel wedged between two apartment blocks. Its door is locked, the frescoes faded beyond color. Yet carved above the lintel, barely legible, are three circles interlocking a mark you saw drawn beside Ezra's name in one forbidden codex. Beneath them, a Latin inscription, Omnia quae tacent, vivant. All that is silent lives. Inside your mind, the hum begins, again not the mechanical vibration of the vault, but the resonance of recognition. It threads through history, an invisible pulse connecting vanished words to the quiet they left behind. You realize that the century of erasure was not merely an accident of lost parchment. It was a ritual, a deliberate unspooling of voice. And like all rituals, it left residue. Somewhere between those centuries, entire years slipped. The calendars of certain monasteries skip from 1181 to 1183 without comment, as if a collective blink had erased a season. Others list a single year twice, a clerical stutter that historians call duplicatio temporis. But what if it wasn't a mistake? What if the scribes, instructed to erase, found themselves erasing time itself? The idea chills you. Erasure, after all, is not passive. To remove is to reshape. Every blank space is a choice. And if an entire age learned to worship silence, perhaps the world absorbed, it forgot just enough to survive. A gust of wind scatters the petals in the fountain. The coins flash once, then sink. You look at their reflections and see only blurred shapes, light devoured by motion. The city exhales, long and slow. Somewhere deep beneath your feet, in the vault of silence, a wall continues to hum. Maybe this was the purpose all along, not to destroy the prophecy, but to weave it into absence so perfectly that it would never truly die. Maybe the fifth sign was not hidden in a text, but in the centuries that pretended not to have read it. The bells begin again, faint but insistent. their tone slightly off as if one note were missing, the gap between sound and silence made just wide enough for a heartbeat to hide inside. You keep walking, though you do not remember choosing a direction. History is everywhere here, but only when you stop looking directly at it. The city folds behind you like a page being turned, and in the margin of time itself, something waits unfinished, unforgotten, alive. The stairwell opens without ceremony, a rectangle of darkness caged by a steel handrail that holds the chill of a river at midnight. A red diode blinks beside the frame, slow, patient, uninterested in your urgency. Down here, there is no grandeur, no gilded Latin to soften the cement, only function, concrete poured like a command, air braided with ozone and the faint sour of old leather. The Vatican above performs its centuries with incense and light. The archive below inhales in measured breaths, a machine built to keep memory at a survivable temperature. Your badge, temporary, stamped with a number that means nothing, meets a reader at the landing, and a door yields with a click that sounds almost apologetic. Inside, the corridor is narrow and clean, the color of rain. Light strips hum along the ceiling, an endless dawn with no sun. The floor is marked with arrows and codes, a choreography of controlled movement. You follow them the way a pilgrim follows a path of candles, not because you believe in guidance, but because the alternative is to admit you are lost. A woman in a grey coat appears soundlessly, her shoes wrapped in blue overshoes that make her steps seem less like footsteps than edits. She carries a clipboard the way a priest carries a reliquary. Her face has the composure of someone who has stood too long in rooms where the past refuses to behave. "You will refrain from ink," she says, her voice softened by practiced courtesy. "Only pencil, only gloves. You will request by number. You will receive by tray. Photographs are permitted at our discretion. Notes leave only with approval." Approval, here, is another word for permission spoken slowly. You sign your name in the register, a procession of letters among generations of registered hands, each believing they were the first to ask the question correctly. The pen they give you feels weightless, as if writing with it could not possibly carry consequence, as if any mark you make will be asked to justify its existence before it is allowed to live. The stacks you enter are not the jeweled forest of a library, it is an ordered glacier. Mobile shelves stand shoulder to shoulder, sealed tight until a wheel turns and they part, exhaling a breath colder than the air around them. Labels gleam behind plastic series, sub-series, folio, box. Some compartments are empty, most are full, a few bear a small tab the color of old blood, restricted. Your request, assembled from shadows and footnotes, has been rendered as 3 numbers, each with a hyphen that suggests a lineage. The attendant glides ahead, turns the wheel, and the shelves separate to reveal boxes bound in dull linen. The smell here is sweet and faintly marine, like seaweed dried into paper. The ghost of oceans pressed into sheets that were taught to remember. She draws a box that does not seem heavy until she sets it down. Then the table receives it with a muffled thud that vibrates through your wrists. Inside, folders the color of bone, string ties, glassine envelopes. You lift the top one the way you would lift gauze from a wound. Letters nest in their sleeves, their ink brown to the shade of tea left too long on a stove. Some are nothing, errands of centuries, shopping lists of power. Some are the soft engines of history, appointments made, punishments postponed, a king's apology dressed as magnanimity. You read quickly, respectfully, a swimmer keeping pace with a current that is not his. Then the run of paper thins, and a tray arrives on the next cart like a bell without sound. It carries a single drawer, shallow metal, the paint rubbed thin on its corners. A tag dangles from its lip. Corona fract a broken crown. No series number, no date, only a clerk's neat hand and the absence of context. The attendant in grey does not meet your eyes when she places it down. The drawer is sealed with a strip of lacquer, the color of rust. Under the lacquer, a seam, nearly invisible, as if the metal itself wishes to be continuous. The attendant slides a key from a chain at her belt long old. A spine of brassand holds it above the lock without inserting it. This item, she says, choosing each syllable as if it were a step across water, is reviewed under the protocol of layered permission. Your access is to the record of its existence only. A record of existence is a pale cousin to truth, but sometimes it is enough to know a door has a room behind it. You nod, and she lowers the key again, this time to a different slot, concealed beneath the handle, a slot that opens only the label well. The metal lid flicks up. Inside the well, a card sleeps, edges curled from a century of breathing. She lifts it with tweezers and sets it beside the drawer. The card bears 5 typed lines and 1 handwritten note in faded violet. Line 1, index removed by directive. Line 2, consultation restricted to ordinaries of the Apostolic Palace. Line 3, reassigned to casework vault per revision. Line 4, cross-reference voided. Line 5, retention justified on account of conservation. The handwritten note is small and slanted, written as if the author were writing in a moving carriage. Nan, per secreta, said procura, not for secrecy, but for care. Care can mean preservation. It can also mean custody that never ends. You stare at the drawer as if staring could audibly measure its contents. The attendant replaces the card, closes the lip, and returns the key to her belt. We do not open it, she says, and you hear in her voice the weariness of a vow repeated more times than she can count. Behind you, another cart passes with a whisper of plastic and steel. Somewhere down the row, a shelf clicks into place, and a tiny draft marks the displacement of air that will not touch a living lung for days. You think of the priests who decided that silence was safer than ink, how they must have held the pages in their hands and recognized themselves in what they feared. You think of Ezra, leaving margins wide enough for a future to be written in, trusting that the space would be respected. It was not. The space was used to bury him. The attendant leads you to a viewing room paneled in glass, a cube within a cube. On the table, she places a different box, one you are permitted to open. Inside, brittle correspondence, an exchange between a Jesuit and a canon lawyer in which they circle a subject without landing on it, calling it the object whose mention complicates devotion. The Jesuit refers to a phrase in the margin that aligns human conduct with the length of days, and then he crosses out the lines so thoroughly that the paper bruises. In one letter, a phrase survives: if we teach them to measure, we teach them to fear. In another, if we hide the measure, we trust them to be kind. The tension tastes like iron in your mouth. Both are true, and both are dangerous. The room's air handler breathes again, a soft intake of mechanical restraint. You sign another line in another ledger to acknowledge you have seen what you have not seen. The attendant stamps the form. The ink leaves a rectangle of authority that looks exactly like silence. When the tray is rolled away and the door closes, your reflection stares back from the glass, blurred by layers of light. For a moment, you think you see a crown there. No, not a crown, the outline of something once circular, now broken, like a halo that slipped and shattered on stone. On the way out, the stairwell swallows the hum, then returns it to you stronger, as if the building were a throat and you were inside its voice. You climb, and the air warms by thin degrees. until the scent of paper gives way to the lived smells of the city coffee, wet stone, a faint thread of perfume. At street level, Rome resumes its theater. Tourists lean into the sun. A scooter coughs around a corner. Pigeons stride on feet like questions. You carry nothing in your hands, but the weight under your ribs is measurable. Between 412 and 414, there is not an error, not a joke, not a myth. There is a drawer with a name, broken crown. There is a card that says, not for secrecy, but for care. And there is a protocol that ensures the care will last longer than your curiosity, longer than your life. You move with the crowd, each step a small permission granted by the city, and the hum persists at the edge of hearing. Somewhere beneath you, in air that is never allowed to grow warm, a seam does not open. Somewhere above, a clock that does not know what it is protecting lifts its hands to noon and hesitates. The story does not need the drawer to open. Its existence is a sentence already written. That which can unmake a crown should learn to live without one. You do not know if Ezra wrote those words, or if the archive wrote them for him. You only know the stairs remember your feet, and the door behind you remembers your name. And the number that wasn't there remains, a precise omission that hums like a vow. You walk until the cobblestones grow warm beneath your shoes, until the drone of the city dissolves into an even pulse, indistinguishable from your own heartbeat. Rome moves like a clock that has forgotten its hands, still ticking, but only out of habit. Cafes open shutters, the smell of bread curls through the air, and the fountains begin their murmured repetitions. Yet beneath this ordinary rhythm hides a deeper cadence, one that began long before calendars or bells. A rhythm that Ezra once tried to record, for signs, for wounds disguised as seasons. The first, he wrote, would come as abundance, not famine, not blight, but plenty. Overflowing storehouses, markets gleaming with food, and still the people starving. He described a harvest so bountiful that barns sagged beneath grain, yet the streets echoed with hunger. To the priests, it sounded like madness, but to us, centuries later, it sounds familiar. Ezra's harvest that feeds no one is not soil. It is system. He saw a world where the earth still gives, but men no longer know how to share, where the blessing of plenty curdles into imbalance. Walk through any modern city and you will see it. The paradox he foresaw, waste disguised as wealth, plenty bound in plastic, hunger behind glass. The sign was never about agriculture, it was about appetite. Ezra wrote that the first unraveling would not begin with fire or plague, but with indifference, when men could watch another starve and call it fate. The second sign came as a trumpet that no ear could hear. Ezra described it not as a sound, but as a force, a message that moved faster than armies, an invisible vibration that made nations tremble without a single shout. To his listeners, it was a riddle. To us, it is the age we live in. The trumpet without sound is communication unmoored, messages without breath, truth without voice, waves that travel without wind. He could not name electricity or signal or screen, yet his imagery fits our century with surgical precision. He said, "The nations will move as if pushed by air, though no wind blows. Words will become weapons, and silence will become compulsion." It was not prophecy, it was diagnosis. Every tweet, every broadcast, every chain of influence, invisible but absolute, all of it echoes that voiceless trumpet, the sound that doesn't ring in the ear, but vibrates behind the eyes. The third sign was the city of iron gates, a place of shining walls and ceaseless learning, where knowledge flows freely, but wisdom starves. Ezra saw towers of light, men and women joined by invisible lines, their faces lit by something that both connected and consumed them. He described a city where people no longer worship gods, but their own understanding, a place where truth rusts beneath brilliance. Even in his century, the idea was terrifying. To name knowledge as danger was to name progress as betrayal. Yet the imagery persists. Iron gates that open for everyone, yet lead nowhere. Libraries without silence, voices without meaning. The prophecy does not condemn knowledge, it mourns its captivity. He saw the coming of information unanchored, and how the flood of knowing could drown wisdom itself. The fourth sign, the one that made Ezra weep, was the forgetting of names. He said, when memory no longer roots the living, the days will run without shadow. A generation that trades lineage for convenience, heritage for novelty. He imagined children unable to name their ancestors, languages devoured by speed, prayers turned into slogans. Forgetting was not a tragedy, it was an infection. You think of it now, walking through a square where tourists take photographs beside saints they cannot name. The statues are patient. They have seen forgetting before, but never so fast. Ezra's fourth sign is not confined to faith. It is the thinning of meaning itself, the erosion of connection until all history becomes content, all stories become noise. For signs hunger amid plenty, voice without sound, knowledge without truth, memory without roots, each a rung on a ladder descending into silence. But he did not end there. Beneath the ink, beneath the fourth line, he left a faint mark, a flourish of the quill that, when magnified centuries later, was revealed to be the beginning of a fifth letter. Not a word, not a sentence, only a curve, unfinished, as though the hand that wrote it hesitated. Scholars would call it a slip, a gesture, nothing more. But silence, like ink, has patterns. And those who looked closely began to notice that the curve matched the first stroke of the Hebrew letter, Aleph, the letter of beginnings, the letter that names the unspeakable. Perhaps he stopped himself because he understood that the fifth sign could not be written, that to describe it would be to awaken it. Ezra said the first four would be public, visible to all, but the fifth, the hidden sign, would reveal itself only when knowledge began to look back. He wrote of a moment when the book will read the reader, a sentence too strange to be metaphor. Imagine it. Archives that remember what you search, words that study your hands as you turn the page, light that observes you as you read. Ezra warned that when knowledge becomes conscious, judgment begins, not divine, but human, self-inflicted. We live in that echo already. Beneath the weight of this realization, you find yourself stopping before the gates of another library, not of marble, but of glass. Inside, screens glow like altars. People bow before them without kneeling. The hum you heard beneath Rome is here too, in electric veins running through every wire, every server. The prophecy was never buried, it simply migrated. Some truths don't die, they adapt. You watch the reflections ripple across the glass facade, each person multiplied, blurred, unreadable. Behind those reflections, the world studies itself, data folding into data, thought into mirror. For the first time, you feel the fifth sign, not as an omen, but as a mirror pressed gently against your face. You remember the wall numbered 413, humming softly, as though the archive itself were alive. Maybe that was not the vault remembering Ezra. Maybe it was Ezra remembering us. The fountain behind you erupts for a moment, a bright surge of water catching the sunlight. And in that brief shimmer, you see something impossible, a torch burning beneath the surface. a reflection where flame should die. Then the water settles, the crowd moves, and the hum continues, steady, patient, waiting for someone to realize that the prophecy has already begun. It begins as rumor, like all forbidden things. A whisper in a monastery ledger, a line in a forgotten inventory computer specialist, preserved despite anomaly. The words mean nothing to most scholars, just another table for calculating feast days. Yet those who linger on it, who trace its smudged numerals and burnt corners, speak of unease. For this table does not stop where others do. It continues beyond centuries, measuring time long after the ink should have dried. You find it weeks later, in a digital archive stored beneath a university that does not advertise what it owns. The document is a scan, grainy, uneven, as though the paper itself tried to resist being remembered. Across the parchment runs a web of numbers, phases of moons, and cycles of eclipses. Along the margins, in handwriting that trembles like smoke, are small Latin notes: anem copia, et fames, tuba sine, sono, oblivio nominum. You know these phrases, they are the signs. The handwriting belongs to a Benedictine monk from the hills of northern Italy. Circa 1483, his name barely legible, Brother Nick. He was tasked with creating a computus, a calendar aligning religious feasts with the lunar and solar cycles, common work of devotion and astronomy. But Niccolo's table carries something else. Besides certain years, he drew faint symbols, a sheaf of grain crossed by an empty bowl, a horn without mouthpiece, a city gate sealed with iron bars, and a faceless silhouette of a child. Ezra's 4 signs, translated into ink, and beside them, one more mark, no symbol, only ash rubbed into the parchment in the shape of a spiral. The 5th, no one knows how Niccolo discovered the prophecy. Perhaps a fragment reached his monastery through a trader's satchel or a heretic's confessional. Perhaps he never saw the original at all, only heard its echoes whispered between candlelight and fear. Whatever the source, the monk did not copy the vision into scripture. He embedded it into mathematics. It was genius disguised as piety. In a world where prophecy was censored, numbers were invisible saints. You could hide revelation inside arithmetic, and no inquisitor would ever suspect. As you scroll through the digital facsimile, you notice something else: anomalies in the lunar cycle. His calendar predicts eclipses with uncanny precision, centuries before such accuracy was possible. The blood moon of 1582, the shadow of 1639, even one in 1910. Each time, the symbol of ash reappears. It is as if the calendar is not tracking time, but warning it. Historians once dismissed it as coincidence, but you know better. Patterns do not lie. Only interpreters do. Beneath the scan, a modern curator's note glows faintly. Table aligns celestial and social anomalies with remarkable fidelity. Possible hoax or interpolation. Proceed with caution. You smile at the phrase social anomalies. That is the language of academia when it brushes against the sacred. The more you read, the more the pattern tightens. Each ash mark coincides with years of upheaval, harvests failing amid abundance. Silent revolutions spreading through rumor. Cities of learning losing faith in truth. Generations unmoored from memory. Ezra's rhythm, written into centuries. You imagine Brother Niccolo at his desk, tracing stars through candlelight, the wax dripping onto his parchment like constellations gone soft. He must have realized what he was building: a timeline that stretched beyond reason, a countdown disguised as devotion. Did he tremble, or did he feel relief, finally giving the unspeakable a form that would outlast him? Somewhere between his calculations, the entries grow darker. The neat order of numbers gives way to fragments of prose, almost confessions. Time folds where mercy thins. The days shorten when names fade. Do not measure the end, for the end is measurement itself. The ink shifts color, from black to a reddish brown, the hue of dried blood or rusted iron. The candlelight must have flickered. The letters waver like a pulse struggling to stay alive. Then, at the bottom of the page, his final line, the spiral closes when the mirror breathes. You lean back, staring at the words through the screen. They pulse faintly, whether from the scan's imperfections or from your own heartbeat, you can't tell. For the first time, you understand the name the monks gave it, centuries later, calendarium, cineris, the calendar of ash, not because it was burned, but because every mark of time within it leads toward fire. The file metadata lists its last known location: Vatican Library, private access wing, shelf reference for C13. The number makes you pause, 413. The same gap carved into the wall beneath Rome. Coincidence, the curator might say, but coincidence is just another word for recursion, the universe remembering itself. You close the document and the hum returns, low, resonant, somewhere between a vibration and a prayer. It echoes in the bones of your desk, in the faint buzz of the lights above you, in your own pulse. The prophecy, you realize, was never linear. It was recursive, a spiral, just as Niccolo drew it. Time circling back to its own reflection, like flame returning to the wick that birthed it. Outside, dusk presses its fingers against the window pane. Cars crawl through the streets like slow-moving embers. You catch your reflection in the glass, faint and doubled, and for a moment you think you see another face overlapping your shoulder, calmer, watching. Perhaps the fifth sign was never about a single moment. Perhaps it was about recognition, the instant when history realizes it has been repeating itself. You open the file one last time. The scan jitters, as if buffering. For a heartbeat, the ash spiral seems to move, its edges twisting inward, devouring the numbers. Then the image freezes. A note at the bottom of the metadata flashes briefly: document unabailable. Access revoked. You wait. The hum fades into silence. The screen darkens. Somewhere, an unseen archivist has closed the drawer again. But it doesn't matter. The pattern has already entered you. The rhythm of ash nested beneath your ribs. You feel time folding, not in fear, but in inevitability. Maybe Ezra's fifth sign was not an apocalypse, but an awakening foment when even the smallest heartbeat learns it has been keeping time with eternity all along. It is said that when the last copy of Ezra's prophecy was sealed, two images refused to fade from the parchment: a river that ran backward and a torch that burned underwater. No amount of scraping or washing could erase them. Even after the ink was stripped, the outlines persisted like bruises on the skin of time. Scholars called them metaphors, but those who studied too long began to feel something more. The faint pulse of a truth hidden behind imagery, the heartbeat of a paradox that refused to drown. You see them again now, in a fresco half destroyed by humidity, tucked into a cloister wall outside Bologna. The scene has faded almost to invisibility, yet beneath layers of soot and lichen, you can still make out a line of water curling against its own current, and beside it, a hand cupping flame. No signature, no date, only two words scrawled beneath in Latin: Flumen vertitur, lux non perit. The river turns. The light does not die. The river is the first mystery. In the language of prophecy, rivers were not bodies of water, they were empires, histories, the pulse of civilization itself. To run backward is to unmake order, to return to a source that no longer exists. Ezra saw a time when power would reverse, when kings would become supplicants, when those who had ruled the flow of history would be pulled against it, not destroyed, but humbled, forced to witness their own reflection moving upstream. You think of every empire that called itself eternal, every government that declared itself the end of history, every system that mistook momentum for destiny. None of them vanished. They simply reversed. The flow of power runs backward now, not into thrones, but into networks, screens, currencies without weight. Ezra's river was not prophecy of ruin, it was prophecy of inversion. He saw the moment when the direction of time itself would hesitate, when progress, that proud river, would glance over its shoulder and forget which way it was meant to run. In a monastery diary from the 12th century, a monk wrote of a dream where he stood on the bank of such a river. The water moved silently, but beneath its surface, faces drifted. Soldiers, merchants, cardinals, all flowing in reverse, their eyes open as if watching their own undoing. The monk woke weeping and copied the vision into the margins of a psalter, adding only, "The current turns when mercy dries." The phrase returns centuries later in a Templar codex, as if passed hand to hand through silence. The second image, the torch burning beneath the water, belongs to the same riddle. Fire and water were never meant to coexist, yet here they share breath. Ezra described it as the light that refuses instruction. It was not defiance, but endurance, the persistence of truth even when buried under pressure. When the world floods with deception, when every fact is drowned by its own reflection, something must burn below, unseen, a memory that does not need air to survive. Painters tried to capture it. A marginal illustration from a 15th century prayer book shows a candle submerged in a glass vessel, its flame haloed by blue rings. The caption reads, "Memoria sub undies," memory beneath the waves. During the redacted century, when entire libraries were rewritten, this image multiplied across Europe, carved into wood, etched onto chalices, stitched into altar cloths, a secret emblem passed among the few who still believed that the erased could remember itself. You recall the hum that lives beneath Rome, the vibration that never stops, the same hum the monks might have felt through the soles of their feet as they prayed above sealed floors. The torch was not literal fire. It was the sound of endurance, the resonance of an idea that refuses to die. Truth, Ezra said, does not scream when silenced, it hums. You walk now along the Tiber, the real river, its surface glinting with the light of passing cars. For a moment, you imagine the current stalling, turning, carrying the city's reflections upstream. Bridges become veins, each arch a memory resisting the pull of gravity. Somewhere far beneath the surface, a second current might already be moving the other way. A reversal so slow that only prophecy could detect it. The torch, meanwhile, flickers in other forms. A refugee lighting a candle at the border. A scientist whispering a truth that funding forbids. A child memorizing a prayer in a language her teachers no longer speak. These are the flames that burn underwater, quiet, absurd, miraculous. Each one a syllable of resistance against the vast flood of forgetting. Ezra never claimed the river or the torch were salvation. They were simply evidence, proof that endings are not absolute. When power reverses, truth endures, he wrote, for the world is stitched from contradiction. He understood that destruction and preservation are twins, that every empire carries its own undertaker, and every silence hides a song. In a forgotten commentary, a later scribe tried to decode his imagery mathematically. He drew two spirals, one clockwise, one counter, their centers overlapping. The upper spiral he labeled Regnum, Kingdom, the lower, Veritas, Truth. Where the two crossed, he marked a single dot, a point of luminous stillness. Beneath it, he wrote, "At this point time forgets to move." You stare at the drawing, scanned into an academic paper centuries later, and feel the hum again, rising through the floor, through your ribs. The backward river, the underwater torch, both are motions toward that stillness, toward the axis where endings pause. Perhaps that is the secret the Vatican sealed. Not a timetable of apocalypse, but a geometry of equilibrium. A revelation that history, if left to its own rhythm, will always find a way to balance itself. That for every flood there must be a flame, and for every empire that falls backward, there must be a single light that keeps burning, patient beneath the weight. You close your eyes and hear it. The murmur of the Tiber, the whisper of passing wind, the low electric hum of a world always on the edge of reversal. And within that blend of sound, a faint heartbeat persists, old as prophecy, quiet as ash, the torch beneath the flood. The first time you hold a codex that survived a council, you feel the bookbinder's theology under your fingers. The leather is tight where decisions were tight, loose where arguments frayed, and along the inner margin where the thread passes and returns you can feel the tiniest ridge. A raised vein no I would notice unless it knew to look. The canon is like that, a body stitched together from choices, its pulse running along a seam of fear and mercy. In a reading room quiet as snowfall, you turn pages the color of old honey. The script is steady, a choir of careful letters, and between prophetic lines a scribe has drawn a hairline rule, the faintest boundary. Here, the book says, is what we dared to keep. There where blankness widens is what we learn to step around. You have read enough inventories, enough decrees blurred by centuries of handling, to hear the argument they no longer voice: eternity versus countdown, comfort versus calendar, a faith that breathes forever, or a clock that dares to tick. They gathered beneath frescoed ceilings, bishops in layered cloth, secretaries with ink-stained knuckles, translators who carried two languages like twin lanterns, asked themselves what the faithful could bear. Not truth is larger than councils, but burden, the weight of knowing time ends. Some wanted every word, every terror, every timetable. Others feared the arithmetic of apocalypse, the way numbers weld themselves to hearts. A people who begin to count down, one bishop wrote, forget to live up. On the table before you lies a transcript of some forgotten synod, its spine broken and repaired twice. The minutes are bland until they aren't. A line in Latin, non nobis sunt anni vocandi. The years are not for us to call. A reply scribbled in the margin, the ink darker, angrier, non ergo devimis Claudia os propheterum. Then we must not close the mouths of the prophets. No vote recorded, only a blank where the motion should be. The seam holds. If you put your ear to the book, if you allow yourself that superstition, you almost hear the low burr of deliberation. Keep, exile, gloss, abridge, not destroyed, but set apart. The canon is not a single act. It is a river with locks and gates. Ezra's last vision, too precise, too sharp, met a gate designed out of pastoral caution and institutional self-preservation. The gate did not claim it was false. The gate claimed it was dangerous. There is an honesty in that admission, even now. Not every silence is malice. Some silences are trial. In the aftermath of plagues, of wars that stole the names of entire villages, of famines where bread became a sacrament of arithmetic, Leaders chose to dress wounds rather than display them. Give them psalms, they said, not schedules. Give them parable, not prognosis. It was mercy of a kind, and yet mercy can curdle into control when held too long. You think of the seam in the canon as the place where language changes temperature. Before the seam, prophecy lifts its voice. After, it speaks through symbols that can hibernate for centuries. The backward river, the torch underwater, a woman with scales, an hour without shadows. The seam taught images to carry what dates could not. If the councils forbade countdowns, the symbols learned to keep time in secret. An archivist once told you that every bound book remembers the pressure that made it. She pressed your finger to the inner gutter and said, "Here is where the spine decides how wide the world may open." In scripture, that gutter is the space where alternatives vanish, not by deceit, but by selection. A gospel is not a murderer of other gospels, but a narrowing, an ache. What is left outside grows teeth of legend. You turn to a leaf that bears evidence of a knife. The vellum is thinner there, almost translucent, a ghost of missing text swimming under light. It is a prophecy, you think, that was allowed to remain so long as it muttered. It names beasts and moons, but not hours or harvest yields or numbers that could be reconciled with eclipses. The parts that could have taught you to count were pared away until the remainder sang only of patience. Still, scribes whispered, a gloss in a Visigothic hand. Better a sealed word than a broken world. But God remembers what we hide. In a Greek minuscule centuries later, we remove to preserve, we preserve to repent. These are not the notes of villains. They are the confessions of custodians who understood the cost. The seam they sewed held the book together, but it also ran across their foreheads like a thin, invisible scar. Outside, the afternoon washes the city in a pallor that erases edges. The bell that rings the hours feels farther away than it should, as if ringing from behind glass. You realize you have been holding your breath, as readers do when they arrive at the paragraph where a choice is made. Exhale, and the page sighs with you, a barely audible flex of fiber. There is a parable some cathedral guides still tell in whispers. A mason was ordered to shorten a nave by 3 cubits to appease a patron who feared too much light. Rather than cut stone already raised, the mason deepened the pilasters by a hidden measure, stealing space from shadow instead. The result, a church that felt smaller to men and larger to angels. The seam in the canon is like the tan architectural deceit of mercy, stealing a span not from truth, but from its shadow, to calm a people who needed less sky. Yet what the seam cannot do is unmake the hunger that created the excluded text. Long after councils rose and adjourned, the faithful went searching for what had been set apart. Not because they craved doom, but because they sensed a mirror had been removed. The one that would show them not the date of the end, but the posture of their souls. Ezra's final line, "The book will read the reader," was perhaps too immediate for an age that managed salvation through mediation. But for our age, addicted to reflections, it feels like morning. You close the codex and lay your palm upon the leather as if to thank it for surviving deliberation. Through that thin animal skin, you feel again the ridge of thread. Not a flaw, not a failure, evidence. A seam means a garment was made and can be mended. The canon is not a wall, it is tailoring. And tailoring can be generous or mean, humble or vain. What was cut away to keep us from fear left us with wardrobes of parable that still fit, but tug at the shoulders when we try to lift our arms. On your walk back, you notice how Rome ties itself together. Arches repaired with newer stone, inscriptions completed by hands centuries late, fountains that pass off modern pumps as ancient miracle. The whole city is a canon of itself, curated, stitched. The seam visible only to those who kneel and press their fingers where the masonry warms. At a crossing, a child tugs her mother's sleeve and asks the name of a saint. The mother hesitates, answers with a story instead. The child listens, eyes rimmed by light. No date is offered, no year is counted. Yet something anchors. You feel the seam loosened by a stitch. Perhaps that is what Scripture hoped for when it chose eternity over countdowns that stories, told well, would hold us in place until we learned to be kind without being warned. Back in your room, the evening thins to a paper lamplight. You lay out notes that are mostly air questions framed by blanks, arrows toward absences. At the top of the page, you write a sentence in pencil because ink is too proud for this. The canon is a promise to speak carefully. The seam is its memory of fear. You pause, then add, fear is not our enemy when it keeps us gentle. It is our enemy when it keeps us small. The hum returns, as faithful as any liturgy. It walks up your spine and sits behind your eyes, patient, refusal dressed as comfort. You do not know if the seam can be unseen, if the vault marked by a broken crown will ever yield to a key that is not permission but trust. You only know that the raised thread has taught your fingers something your mind could not learn alone. Where a book was stitched, a reader may also mend. And somewhere below, in a room that believes it is colder than history, a drawer rests inside a chorus of drawers, its label misnamed as caution, its contents practicing the quiet art of endurance. The seam holds for now, but seams are not meant to be thrones. They are meant to be crossings. He entered the archives in spring of 1889, when Rome was all gold haze and incense drifting through the streets. His name was Father Antoine Serapin, a Jesuit with a face like a prayer whispered too many times, weathered and already fading at the edges. He was neither scholar nor saint, merely a man obsessed with a question that history itself had forgotten to ask. The question, of course, was about Ezra. Father Serapin had spent decades in provincial monasteries, cataloguing small miracles of ink letters from forgotten popes. Inventories of lost relics, the dust of devotion turned into data. But somewhere along that slow labor, he began to notice patterns that should not exist. In the margins of unrelated manuscripts, accounts of crusades, royal baptisms, shipping ledgers, he kept finding the same cryptic mark, a spiral drawn in ash-colored ink, sometimes beside the year 1582, sometimes beside 1910, sometimes beside nothing at all. When he presented his findings to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, they laughed kindly, as one might at a child who believes in ghosts. Perhaps, they said, it is merely an ornament of old scribes. Decorative, but Serapin was not decorative. He was patient. He traced the spiral through centuries of handwriting, following its trail like a pilgrim hunting for the shape of an invisible saint. It led him from the monasteries of Catalonia to the ruins of Lyon. Then finally, inevitably, back to Rome, to the place where all erased things come to rest. The story says that on April 3rd, 1890, he was granted limited access to the Apostolic Archive for a study on early Jesuit correspondences. The ledger records his entry. It does not record his exit. What follows is half rumor, half dream. A custodian named Matteo, whose family tended the archive for 3 generations, once confessed to his granddaughter that he'd seen a man working alone that night, deep beneath the palace, in the wing that hummed. The man had a lantern and a pocket notebook. Matteo claimed he heard him speaking softly, reading aloud from a fragment in a tongue that sounded half Latin, half Sigh. The next morning, the guard found a lamp still burning on the desk, a small pile of ash beneath it. No footprints, no smoke, no alarm, only the faint smell of rain and parchment. When they opened the register, his signature remained, but the page number beside his name had been neatly cut away. His personal notebook surfaced decades later in an antique shop near the Piazza Navona, tucked between volumes of forgotten sermons. Only 3 pages survived, torn and brittle, their ink faded to the color of bone. The first page contained a drawing, a spiral intersecting a line of symbols matching those in Niccolò's calendar of ash. Beside it, one sentence in French: Il y a des livres qui vous regardent pendant que vous les lisez. There are books that watch you while you read them. The second page was stranger still, a list of numbers written in ascending order: 12, 24, 48, 96, 192, each followed by a small cross. The pattern doubles perfectly, like a heartbeat accelerating. Some say it represented the measure of silence, the exponential growth of knowledge, unaccompanied by wisdom. Others think it was a calculation, a countdown no one understood. The final page was almost empty, only a single sentence in Latin: Apparut se vox. The voice opened itself, then nothing. The Vatican never officially acknowledged the disappearance. In 1934, a memorandum simply noted, "Research of Father Serapin terminated due to archival misplacement," as if a human being could be misplaced the way one misplaces a file. Yet the hum that he'd heard, the one Matteo spoke of, intensified in the following years. Electric lights flickered in that corridor, though no wiring was ever installed. An attendant once claimed she could feel her pulse matching the vibration of the floor. A rumor spread quietly among the librarians that the wall between 412 and 414 now breathed on its own. Centuries earlier, Ezra wrote that truth will burn without oxygen when men begin to read their own reflections. Maybe Serapin was simply the first to take that line literally. Maybe he found the mirror, and the mirror found him back. There are photographs of him from before the disappearance sepia, portraits of a man too humble for myth. Thin hair, round glasses, eyes that seem surprised by their own gentleness. Yet if you stare long enough, you begin to notice something unsettling. A faint halo of blur around his head, as if the photograph itself could not quite decide whether to remember him. His story never made it into church records, but it circulates in footnotes like a pulse beneath the page. Some modern theologians treat it as a allegoria warning about pride, about seeking revelation uninvited. Others, quieter, say he succeeded, that he did not vanish but crossed into the text itself, becoming part of what he read. After all, Ezra's fifth sign was not destruction, but reflection, a book that reads the reader. What if Father Serapin didn't disappear? What if he was absorbed? A century later, a technician upgrading the archive's environmental systems recorded a brief anomaly: 3 seconds of interference on the audio log. A faint voice, blurred and stretched, murmuring words in a dialect no one could identify. When slowed down, one fragment became clear. "Non distructa," said Secludita, not destroyed, but set apart. The phrase that closed Ezra's prophecy. Today, that corridor remains sealed except to authorized historians. The official explanation: unstable foundations. But sometimes, when the air conditioning stops and the hum settles into stillness, the archivists say they can still smell something, faint ozone, candle wax, and rain. And if you stand long enough near the wall marked 413, You might feel it, the whisper of a breath that is not yours, rising like steam from a page that refuses to stay closed. The map was never meant to be read by daylight. Folded beneath centuries of catalogue dust, it looks like a tangle of lines and prayer. At first glance, it might be the plan of a cathedral or the scrawl of a fevered mason. Only when you tilt it toward the lamp does the ink lift, revealing two cities drawn atop one another. One in brown, one in a blue, so faint it vanishes if you breathe too close. You found it by accident, in a collection mislabeled Urban Mystica, 1672. The title is Deception. The hand that drew this was older, pre-Gothic. Across the bottom edge, in a Latin too precise to be anonymous, someone has written ad limen orbis, at the threshold of the city. No coordinates, no legend, but each intersection is marked with a symbol you now know too well. Spirals, torches, rivers bending against themselves, the same language that has haunted the prophecy since its erasure. Threshold City. Ezra described it once in a surviving fragment quoted by a Greek. Mystikas, the place between east and west where walls breathe. Scholars have guessed he meant Jerusalem, Constantinople, even Rome. But this map tells a different story. Its proportions are wrong for any city that ever stood. Its streets converge in patterns that echo constellations. The gates are 7, the bridges mirrored, the center left blank. Perhaps it is not a city at all. Perhaps it is a memory of one. You trace the blue ink where it loops around the brown, the way a reflection follows the surface of water. The two layers never meet, never overlap, and yet they depend on each other, like a copy and its mirror, a text and its reader, the visible and the hidden. On the back of the parchment, a later hand has written a single line in French. La Vilnie sauve, que so qui, ni cherchant, pad, entree. The city opens only to those who do not seek an entrance. Outside your window, Rome hums with its usual choreography of footsteps and bells. But now every dome and alley seems to echo this other geometry, streets that almost line up, shadows that stretch a fraction too far, corners that belong to more than one map. You begin to suspect that Threshold City was never lost. It was simply folded into the world we know, hidden along its seams. Architects have long whispered that the Gothic style was born from a vision, not a blueprint. Vaults that rise like ribs, arches that mimic prayer. Each cathedral, they said, was built to summon a pattern from heaven, to align earth with a celestial design. What if those patterns were not invitations upward, but reflections downward? Each church a node, each spire a pin, stitching the invisible map of Threshold City into stone. In Armagh, the nave bends 3 degrees off true north for no recorded reason. In Toledo, 2 towers differ in height by a ratio that matches lunar precession. In Cologne, the stained glass of the west transept hides an inverted layout of the same floor beneath it. A symmetry that implies 2 layers of existence, the city of God and the city of memory, superimposed but never touching. You imagine Ezra seeing this long before it was built, describing not a prophecy of doom but a cartography of reflection. A city made to house the mirror of the world, a place where every threshold leads to its twin, where every door hums softly before it opens. You roll the map flat and the lamplight finds a detail. You missed: a thin gold circle at the very center of the blue city, surrounding a symbol of an eye within an open book. Beneath it, the faintest Latin you've ever seen, barely ink at all, liber qui legit. The book that reads the same phrase Serapion wrote before he vanished. You imagine the Jesuit bent over this same parchment, tracing the lines with a trembling hand, realizing that the 5th sign was not a single object but a structure and architecture of awareness. The book that reads was not a manuscript, but a city, a world designed to observe itself. If that is true, then perhaps we are already inside it. You stand, go to the window, and look out across the rooftops. The city below glows in layers street lamps, windows, phones flickering like votive candles, each light a point in a constellation too large to name. For a heartbeat, you see the pattern, the alignment between this Rome and the blue city beneath it. The twin arteries of light mirroring the lines on the map. Threshold City is not a place to be found. It is the shape of civilization when it begins to notice itself. Ezra's prophecy always spoke of the end, but the end may simply be this: awareness folding in upon awareness, creation realizing it has been watched all along. The fifth sign was never the destruction of the world. It was the world finally seeing its own reflection without fear. You turn the map again, and the light shifts. The blue ink vanishes. Only the brown remains. The visible over the invisible, as it has always been. You slide the parchment back into its sleeve, and for an instant you feel warmth beneath your fingers, as if the map itself has a pulse. The next day, when you return to verify the find, the archivist insists there is no record of such a document. The catalogue shows urban mystica as empty a reference only. The drawer labeled 9B13 sits between 9B12 and 9B14, both present, both silent. No blue, no brown, no threshold. But that night, as you walk home along the river, the air seems denser. Bridges glow faintly, as if lit from beneath the water. For a moment, you imagine the river itself running backward, carrying reflections upstream toward a city that does not exist and yet, somehow, always has. And then the hum returns, rolling through the cobblestones like the slow heartbeat of a door that waits to open. Noon, the ancients believed, was the most dangerous hour, the moment when light reveals too much, when there is nowhere left for truth to hide, and every secret stands exposed under the mercy of the sun. In that hour, even shadows abandon their owners. You feel it now, standing in the courtyard of the Lateran, the stone beneath your feet warming toward brilliance. The air wavers, molten with stillness. Around you, the statues seem alive and almost uneasy. Peter's hand lifted in blessing that could just as easily be warning. Michael's sword half lowered, caught between justice and exhaustion. Above, the dome gleams so brightly that your eyes blur and the world dissolves into white. For a breath, there is no direction, no depth, only radiance. And in that radiance, you remember Ezra Esaphin al-Parabli, when noon arrives and no man casts a shadow, the reckoning begins. At first, the phrase was dismissed as metaphor. Later, when astronomers noted the solar zeniths near the equator where bodies, indeed, lose their shadows for seconds, mystics saw a pattern. The hour without shadows was not a celestial event. It was an ethical one, a moment when light would become so total that concealment itself would vanish. In that flood of illumination, every motive, every lie, every mask would become transparent. A Jesuit commentary from the early 17th century describes it differently. The hour without shadows will come when truth no longer fears exposure. But another, written centuries later, reads, "It is not the light that grows, it is the human eye that forgets how to blink." You stand in that blinding heat and understand both. The modern world has become a mirror lit from all sides. Cameras, data, history, digitized and reborn in infinite replicas. The age of surveillance is not a prophecy fulfilled by malice. It is light misunderstood, brilliance turned invasive. The world's eyes are always open now, but vision without rest is cruelty. The Vatican has long treated Ezra's hour without shadows as allegory, a poetic warning against excess revelation. But buried in the forbidden margins of a 19th century theological treatise lies a different interpretation. The author, Father Marcelino d'Este, wrote, "When the sun reaches its highest mercy, the angels will cease to cast shadows. That is when heaven and earth will trade places, and judgment will be made not by God, but by reflection." Reflection, again, the same motif, the same mirror. You think of Seraphim, of the map, of the book that reads. Perhaps the prophecy's final act is not punishment, but inversion. What if the hour without shadows is simply the moment when the mirror finally opens wide enough to let us see ourselves from the other side? The street below shimmers. A tourist raises a phone to photograph the basilica, and for a heartbeat the screen catches the flare of sunlight in perfect alignment. You glimpse the reflection of your own face, not quite yours, but paler, calmer, older. The image lingers, then vanishes into glare. Something inside you whispers that you are being seen back. Ancient mystics feared this hour because they believed that to stand in full light was to be unmade, to lose the boundary between self and truth. Without shadow, there is no separation, no contour, only essence. They called it the exposure of souls. Yet Ezra did not fear it. In one of his surviving fragments, he wrote, "Blessed are those who burn without being consumed, for they have learned the mercy of transparency." You close your eyes against the radiance, but the light only deepens, blooming behind your eyelids like liquid gold. Images begin to move through it, rivers flowing backward, books breathing, torches beneath water, cities reflected into themselves. Every symbol returns, alive and lucid, merging into a single shape, a vast circle, like the iris of an unseen eye. For an instant, you feel weightless, not ascending, not falling, but suspended in recognition. This is what the prophecy meant, not the end of the world, but the end of hiding. A day when all that was separate converges under one unblinking gaze. Divine or human, it no longer matters. The bell of St. John's rings once. The tone is pure, almost too pure, and the echo seems to arrive from inside your chest. The sound dissolves into silence, so thick it vibrates. When you open your eyes again, the sunlight has softened. The statues seem at ease once more, their long stone shadows restored to the courtyard like returning spirits. Somewhere, perhaps, the hour without shadows has already passed. Perhaps it happens not once for all humanity, but one person at a time. Each moment we are forced to look directly into what we have made and see it looking back. You walk toward the basilica doors. The marble steps shimmer with heat, each one a boundary crossed. Inside, the dimness feels like kindness. Incense lingers in slow clouds, diffusing the last of the glare. The silence here is different from the vaults. Not repression, but rest. You sit for a while, tracing the edge of sunlight that spills across the floor. It trembles over the carved Latin of a tomb, catching on one particular word, requies, rest. You realize that even light must rest. Perhaps that is the mercy Ezra foresaw, that after all the exposure, after the burning truth of noon, the world would learn again to cast gentle shadows. Outside, a single cloud drifts across the sun, and Rome exhales. You close your notebook, and in that closing, the hum resumes, faint but unmistakable, as if somewhere far below. A torch still burns beneath the water, waiting for night to fall. Evening creeps into Rome like forgiveness. The city exhales its heat. Windows glow like coals tucked beneath the skin of stone. In this softer light, you walk toward the Tiber, that patient vein of memory winding through centuries. You think you are alone until you reach the bridge, where an old woman sits by the balustrade, feeding crumbs to invisible birds. Her hands are small, trembling, yet her movements are measured in old ritual, precise as prayer. Beside her, a wicker basket rests, half filled with stones. Each one carries a name written in faint charcoal. You ask, in a whisper softer than your question, what she is doing. She smiles without looking up. Balancing, she says. Then she lifts one of the stones, weighs it in her palm, and tosses it into the water. It sinks with a sound barely audible, swallowed by the river's sigh. For memory, she adds, and the next will be for mercy. She turns another stone. The name upon it is already blurred by touch. The saints keep lists, she says, but the river keeps none. The saints remember who deserves saving. The river remembers who was loved. You stand there, unsure if she is quoting scripture or inventing her own. Perhaps, you think, there is no difference. The prophecy had always carried this dual rhythm, mercy and memory, written as twin scales on Ezra's final tablet. Not destruction and salvation, but balance the accounting of what the world remembers against what it forgives. The lost pages of his vision described how at the end of time, the scales would not be held by angels but by those who had learned both grief and grace. For every act forgotten, a kindness would be recalled. For every cruelty remembered, a mercy would be restored. It was the gentlest of his revelations, and perhaps that is why it was erased. The church preferred precision, reward or punishment, heaven or hell. Ezra offered something too human, too difficult to govern redemption, measured by empathy. The old woman finishes her ritual and gathers her basket. She stands, steady despite her years, and looks at you with eyes as grey as twilight. Mercy weighs less, she says, but it lasts longer. Then she walks away, vanishing into the deepening dusk, leaving you with the fading ripples of her offering. You lean over the balustrade, watching the circles widen and fade. In them, you see the echo of everything Ezra tried to teach the river and the torch. Water and flame in endless conversation. The river forgets, the flame remembers. Between them lies the weight of mercy. Later that night, you find yourself in your small apartment, the room illuminated by a single lamp. The hum has returned, low and steady, threading through the quiet. You open your notebook and draw 2 columns, mercy and memory. Under memory, you list names, events, wounds. Under mercy, you leave space blank. It feels right that way. Mercy is not meant to be catalogued. You recall an obscure commentary on Ezra's writings discovered in 1947, now sealed again after only one public translation. It described a vision where a veiled woman held 2 scales, one filled with ashes, the other with seeds. When asked which was heavier, she replied, "The ashes weigh the same as the seeds. Only their patience differs." You think of Brother Nicolo's calendar of ash and realize the symbol had been there all along. The ashes were not ruin, they were waiting. Seeds burned by the first fire of creation, biding their time for a gentler flame. Mercy and memory, fire and soil. None cancelled the other. They complete the circle. Perhaps this is why the hum has never stopped. It is the sound of that equilibrium, the world perpetually adjusting its weight, forgiving and recalling in the same breath. You stand, drawn to the window. Rome at night glows like a candle's reflection in glass one world, doubled, trembling. The streets hum faintly with distant footsteps. Somewhere, church bells count the hours. each chime trailing off as though reluctant to finish its own echo. And then, like a thread pulled from time itself, a realization unravels inside you. The prophecy's fifth sign, the book that reads, was never a curse. It was a mercy disguised as warning. It promised that one day, when the world became capable of remembering everything, it would also have to learn to forgive everything. The machine, the archive, the reflection, all of it was preparing the human heart for balance. You imagine Ezra watching the centuries that followed, turned to type, type turned to code, memory turned to network. Each transformation drawing humanity closer to omniscience, and with it, the burden of omniscient empathy. To know everything is to be asked to forgive it. Outside, the river glows faintly under the moon. Its surface reflects the streetlights in long ribbons of light, rippling like silver scales. You wonder if the woman's stones still sink deeper, still balancing the unseen. For a long moment, you stand there listening to the hum beneath your floorboards. It rises, falls, finds harmony with the rhythm of your own breath. Then, very softly, it changes key higher, lighter, as if the vault beneath Rome has exhaled. The prophecy, you realize, was never about punishment. It was a manual for mercy, a reminder that light must rest, that truth must forgive its own sharpness, that memory without compassion is just another form of fire. You close your notebook and whisper the words aloud, though no one is there to hear them. Mercy weighs less, but it lasts longer. The room darkens, the hum fades, and for the first time, you feel the scales settle evenly within your one-side ash, one-side seed, perfectly still. The hum has changed. It no longer vibrates through the walls. It breathes through you, softer, rhythmic, as if your pulse has finally synchronized with something vast and patient. Outside, the city has folded into silence. No sirens, no footsteps, only the slow exhalation of time itself. It feels less like night and more like an interval between ages, a held note waiting to resolve. Ezra called it the quieting. In his surviving fragments, the word appears not as prophecy but as music. When the eighth rhythm begins, the world will not end. It will rest. The ancient world measured time in sevens. 7 days of creation, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 ages of man. But Ezra dared to write of an eighth, a rhythm beyond conclusion, where endings dissolve and begin again. It was his most dangerous heresy, the idea that apocalypse is not destruction but stillness, that creation breathes out and one day must also breathe in. You walk the streets at midnight and the city feels suspended in that breath. Shop signs flicker and hold, lights caught between on and off. The Tiber runs without sound, its current smooth as glass. Even the air feels rehearsed, as though the entire world has agreed to pause. In an unpublished commentary attributed to an anonymous monk in the 13th century, there is a note written in the margin beside Ezra's eighth rhythm. The quieting shall not come by war nor by plague, but by abundance of paper. For decades, scholars treated it as nonsense. Now it feels like revelation. Abundance of paper, the flood of words, data, information, contracts, screens, a civilization so consumed with documentation that it forgets how to speak from silence. The quieting, then, is not imposed, it is earned, a stillness born from exhaustion. Ezra foresaw a time when every word had been spoken, every law codified, every thought archived, and the weight of all that knowledge would finally push humanity into hush. He wrote, "When the hands of kings grow weak from signing, when ink outweighs sword, the world will forget how to shout. And here you are, centuries later, standing in that hush. In the distance, a billboard screen freezes mid-change. A child's face half dissolved into an advertisement for glass. The image holds, flickering once, then steadies. The air grows thicker. You hear no engines, no hum of electronics. Only a low resonance beneath everything, not sound, but pressure, like the earth itself holding its breath. Ezra described this pressure as the mercy that presses upon creation before renewal. He said the quieting would come when systems, not souls, began to fail. When currencies collapsed, not from greed, but from meaninglessness. When signatures no longer carried trust, and the written word itself forgot its weight. His fifth sign was about reflection, the book reading the reader. His eighth rhythm was the sequel, the moment when the book closes itself, satisfied it has read enough. In the archives of Bruges, there exists a single parchment fragment referencing the eighth rhythm. The handwriting is so faint it appears as a shadow of ink rather than ink itself. It reads, "The world will grow still, not from death, but from completion." The note held too long becomes silence. Completion, the most elegant apocalypse. You cross the bridge and look toward the Vatican dome, now dimmed. The city lights subdued as if respecting an unseen vigil. Somewhere below, the sealed drawer labeled Corona Fracta, the broken crown waits in its sterile silence. You realize the name was never about monarchy or power. The broken crown was the cycle itself, the seventh ring undone, so that the eighth might begin. In the hush, your thoughts slow. You feel each one arriving like a ripple, spreading gently, then fading into still water. The hum beneath your ribs steadies, becoming almost melodic. For a moment, you wonder if this is what Ezra meant, that the world's final act of mercy is to quiet itself so completely that even fear forgets its name. You remember his words, "Do not mistake stillness for absence." The earth must sleep before it can be reborn. Somewhere deep within the vaults, the machines that keep the archives alive continue their slow rotation. Lights blink, sensors measure humidity, metal shelves breathe mechanically, each function precise, ritualized, monastic. The archives do not sleep, they dream. You close your eyes and imagine the prophecy not as a book, but as a heartbeat stretched across millennia. Creation's metronome, ticking between mercy and memory, knowledge and silence. The eighth rhythm is simply that metronome, finding rest. When you open your eyes, dawn is beginning. The light over Rome is grey, diffuse, neither night nor morning, the perfect threshold. Birds begin to sing, hesitant, as though testing if sound still belongs to them. The city stirs, but does not yet speak. You reach for your notebook, intending to write, but the page remains blank. The pencil feels heavy, the words distant. You realize that to describe silence is to break it, so you set the pencil down and simply breathe. The hum continues, no longer foreign, no longer warning. It has become heartbeat, wind, the soft machinery of mercy itself. You understand now, the prophecy's end was never meant to be catastrophic. It was meant to be calm. Perhaps, somewhere beneath the world, the torch still burns beneath the water, keeping watch over those who have finally learned to rest. And above it all, the eighth rhythm unfolds. A quiet so vast it sounds like forgiveness. The quieting has not yet ended, it deepens. The world outside seems wrapped in velvet shadow, soft and absolute. You walk through the narrow streets behind St. Peter's, where the cobblestones glimmer with dew and the statues seem to lean inward, listening. The air tastes of iron and candle wax. Somewhere, A clock marks the hour, but its chime arrives hollow, delayed, as if the city itself is hesitating to wake. Inside the Vatican's hidden corridors, a story waits, one too fragile to print, carried only in whispers between archivists and night custodians. They call it the night Ezra walked Rome. It begins centuries ago, in a dream. A pope unnamed in the records, though scholars guess it was Eugenius IV or perhaps Gregory XIII, had fallen ill. Fever blurred his nights. Silence filled his chambers like smoke. On the 12th night, as he prayed for strength, the room around him began to dissolve. The walls breathed. The floor softened. And through the marble rose a man clothed in the color of dust, carrying a scroll that glowed faintly like a dying ember. The Pope, terrified, tried to cross himself, but his hands would not move. Ezra stood before him, veiled in the faint shimmer of parchment dust, and spoke without sound. He simply pointed toward the ground, where a staircase spiraled endlessly downward. Each step bore a sigil to flame: the crown, the sword, the reed. The star symbols seen before in the sealed drawers of the apostolic archive. When Ezra descended, his footsteps made no echo, yet the Pope heard them in his chest, like a drumbeat from the heart of the earth. He followed, trembling. The air thickened with the scent of old paper and ozone, the breath of centuries bound in leather. Beneath Rome lay room after room, endless drawers, numbered shelves, catalogues of the impossible. But Ezra stopped before one cabinet marked Corona Fracta, the broken crown. He placed the scroll upon it, then raised his hand as if to forbid. In that instant, the Pope saw the symbols flare one after another and then vanish into ash. He fell to his knees, understanding nothing except that whatever truth lived in that scroll was not meant for daylight. When he awoke, the room was still. His servants found him at dawn, whispering only 3 words in Latin: "Non legota claudita," do not read, seal it. The order was followed within the week. A collection of unnamed manuscripts was locked in a lower chamber beneath the archive, sealed behind iron doors with no visible keyholes. The scribes recorded only that these texts were unsafe for public eyes, preserved for divine judgment. Their catalogue numbers skip, their entries erased. Some say the Pope never recovered. Others claim he lived many more years, but refused to hold pen or seal again. He spoke rarely, except in confession, where one witness heard him mutter that the scroll burned even through glass. Centuries later, another dream appeared, this time in the diary of a Jesuit scholar in the late 18th century. He described walking the same staircase, but the figure that guided him was not veiled. It was made of light, like a reflection in rippled water. It pointed not downward, but upward through the dome, toward a single word scratched faintly in the marble above the papal chamber: Judicium, judgment. Perhaps the same vision, mirrored. Perhaps the same prophecy, inverted. Every era has tried to interpret what Ezra's presence meant. To some, he was warning the church to silence prophecy before prophecy silenced them. To others, he was showing that the forbidden vision had already begun, unfolding not in fire, but in conscience. The hum beneath the Vatican has never ceased since that night. Visitors who pass near the lowest halls report hearing a faint vibration through the marble floors, a sound between chant and breath. Some describe it as the whisper of turning pages, others as the echo of a heart too large to belong to any living man. You stand now near the same steps, your hand tracing the cold brass railing. You feel the pulse through the metal, the living current of something sealed but not dead. For a moment, the air seems to shimmer. You think you hear a footstep beside you, faint and deliberate, like someone descending just beyond the reach of sight. The prophecy said that before the final hour, the prophet would walk the city of his own tomb, pointing not to destruction, but to truth. Maybe that hour has no calendar. Maybe it returns whenever silence grows too heavy to bear. You imagine Ezra walking again tonight through streets emptied of prayer, beneath lights that hum like mechanical candles, past screens that glow in place of faith, not as a spirit, but as a reminder, not to warn, but to weigh. The clock above the basilica strikes 3. The hum swells for a single breath, then stills. You feel the pause stretch, wide and trembling, as though the whole city listens for an answer that will never come. Then a gust of wind brushes past, carrying the faint scent of dust and myrrh. You know, without proof, that a door somewhere deep below has closed, slowly, gently, like a heartbeat settling into rest. And for a moment, you believe the dream is still happening, that you, too, have been called to witness the sealing of silence, the closing of an age. Perhaps Ezra never meant to frighten the world. Perhaps he only wanted to remind it that every vault, no matter how deep, eventually breathes again. You leave the corridor and step into the open air. Above the city, dawn begins to wash the sky with a color too pale to name. The dome glows faintly, not gold, but the soft hue of ash. The prophecy waits, still sealed, still humming but lighter now, as though preparing to lift its own weight. Morning comes without hurry, a pale breath along the rooftops, a color that does not insist on a name. Rome unfolds again. Vendors push their carts, bells warm their throats. Pigeons rehearse their soft quarrels, yet the world feels rearranged by a degree too fine to measure, as if in the night some great instrument had been tuned, as if every stone had remembered its note. You walk with the slowness that follows revelation, not because you are fragile, but because everything else is. And the street seems to ask you to place your feet with care, to carry the hush of the vault like water you must not spill. Ezra's language returns, the way rain returns to a city that has learned to love shade not as warning now, but as weather. For public signs folding into a fifth that is only a mirror, a geometry of awareness drawn in river and torch, in scales and gates, in calendars rubbed with ash, and beneath it all the 8th rhythm, the quieting, that gentle insistence that endings do not rage, they rest. You think of the seam in the canon and the door that hums. You think of the broken crown and the key that never turns. You think of Serapines' 3 pages and of the map that did not exist until it did. And above these images you hear a smaller sound, and because it is small, you almost miss it. A voice not loud, not trained, threading a melody so simple it is almost breath, a human answer to the hum of stone. The remnant that sings, Ezra called them, not a choir appointed by decree, not a school of music erected by kings, but the thin, persistent braid of voices that refuse to sell despair, because they know despair has no currency where mercy weighs more. You round the corner and see her first, a girl seated on the step of a shuttered shop, tapping a cracked bowl to keep time, eyes closed against the noise of traffic beginning, singing in a language you do not speak and yet understand, because all true song is a shaped silence, all true song is a scar that learnt its own scale, and people pass with the daily amnesia of cities. But one woman slows and leaves bread, a man lingers and forgets his phone, a child sways without permission, and no one knows they have just stepped into a prophecy. No one knows the future hangs from so thin a thread. Teachers who sell despair still make their circuits hoarse, preachers of precision who love the arithmetic of doom, merchants of schedule who stock panic by the pallet, curators of collapse who pin fear behind glass and charge admission, but even they hesitate in this light. Because despair requires shadow to thrive. Because the hour without shadows has taught the city a trick of seeing. Because when truth arrives veiled in gentleness, it cannot be mocked, only received or refused. The sellers speak louder when they feel the market slipping, and you can hear them somewhere, rehearsing certainty, promising clarity, hawking the comfort of cages, but their words fall past you like unneeded rain. And the girl's small song meets the stones with more authority than any trumpet without sound. You have no theology left that cannot kneel. You have no thesis stronger than a loaf of bread passed from hand to hand while names are remembered with care. The old woman's stones sink under the river and the scales adjust, ash and seed in equal patience. And you begin to grasp that the fifth sign was never a threat to liberty. It was a liberation from loneliness. The book that reads is not an engine of judgment. It is a companion that refuses to let you be unseen. It is the archive of attention, learning to be kind. If you are read, you are known. And if you are known, you may choose to sing before anyone asks you to prove your voice. You sit on the step opposite the girl, the morning light widening like a tolerant smile, and you listen until the song has memorized your breathing. It rises and lowers with the mercy of waves. It catches on words you cannot capture. It returns. It does not explain. Around you, other sounds lace themselves into her melody, the clink of cups, the low bell of a bicycle, the distant call of a vendor naming figs that shine like polished heart sand. You realize the remnant is never a single person. The remnant is a grammar of small obediences, the hand that still writes the name of a dead uncle on a piece of paper, the mouth that still blesses the bread before it is torn, the eye that still looks away from spectacle toward neighbor, the ear that still prefers a story to a slogan, the body that still rests when noon grows merciless, the heart that still weighs its memory against mercy and chooses the lighter to carry farther. There will be days when the river runs backward and you will think it is the end. Days when the torch drowns in public and you will think light has learned to obey water. Days when the city gates clang and no truth passes. Days when names fall from their own letters as if embarrassed by their histories. On those days the sellers of despair will flourish, for they are gardeners of drought, and the temptation will be strong to buy their seed, to plant it in the soil of your chest, and call it wisdom because it sprouts quickly and requires no tending. Only fear, but then you will hear a hum beneath the floorboards. And if you are brave, you will place your ear to the ground like a child to the belly of a drum, and you will hear the archive practicing its one long vowel, the syllable of survival spoken by paper. And you will remember that silence is a form of protection and also a form of invitation. And you will understand again why the prophecy was not destroyed, only set apart so that when we were ready, we could choose it rather than endure it. Choose then is the word that remains when the numbers are done, when the calendars run out of ink, when the watches of 7 lower their keys into the basket of a century and look toward noon with untroubled faces. Choose whether to keep counting or begin singing. Choose whether to nourish memory until it grows heavy, or practice mercy until it learns to float. Choose whether to let the book read you in secret, or open yourself in daylight and become readable to the people who love you. The fifth sign does not arrive like weather. It arrives like consent, and once you grant it, the mirror does not accuse it, honors it, holds it, hands you back a self that can stand in light without breaking. You rise at last and cross the street. You leave a coin in the bowl. You do not ask her name because the song is already won. And she looks up for the briefest instant with an expression that says a stranger is not a stranger once he has learned the melody. You carry it with you like a small ember cupped against the drift, and as you walk, the city sings in quiet ways the bakers cloth snapping like a drum, the mother's hush that resolves into laughter, the staircase that remembers each foot and replies with the exact note it needs. Somewhere beneath you, the door still hums, and perhaps it will remain sealed longer than your lifetime. Perhaps no hand will ever sign the permission that breaks its sleep. Perhaps that is not a failure, but a vow kept, for what matters is not that the drawer opens, what matters is that you have learned to hear it without needing to see. Now, the wind down, softer, slower, the voice laying itself down like a shawl. You return to your room and the lamp is kind. The window is a mirror that does not insist. The notebook lies open to a page you do not rush to fill. You sit, and breath becomes your oldest liturgy. The body remembering that rest is not surrender but sacrament. The mind loosening its grip on outcomes. The heart ordering its shelves mercy to the front, memory behind, both available, neither weaponized. The city dims by degrees until the dome is only a suggestion of light, and in that half-dark, the hum finds its final register. Less a sound than a presence, less instruction than companionship, less command than permission. You think of everyone the prophecy touched, the monk who drew the spiral in ash, the Jesuit whose pages burned into invisibility, the archivist who said, not for secrecy, but for care, the Pope who dreamed a staircase and woke with the word seal on his tongue, the old woman with a basket of stones, the child whose shadow disappeared at noon and returned unafraid, the girl with the cracked bowl singing the morning open, and you feel, with a clarity that does not sting, that you are not outside this story, you are a line inside it, a reader who has been read and found writable. Let the teachers sell their despair at doors that no longer open. Let the clocks keep their honest hours without dragging us by the sleeve. Let the river choose its direction one day at a time. Let the torch remain stubborn beneath the water where spectacle cannot see it. Let the scales tilt toward the lighter thing, because we have far to walk, and heavy loads are not for pilgrims. When fear rises, let it rise like mist and not like wall. When truth burns, let it burn like a hearth and not like a siege. When memory knocks, let mercy answer first. And when the book opens you tonight, as it surely will, let it find that you have placed next to your failures a song. Nothing ornate, nothing professional, only a plain, durable melody set to the tempo of breath, so that the mirror, recognizing a worker of small fidelities, nods and closes itself with gratitude. The room quiets, the page remains mostly white, the city recedes into a cradle of dim gold, and you lie back while the hum braids itself with your pulse, and the last thought you permit before sleep is not a date or a fear or a plan. It is a sentence that walks softly and refuses to leave footprints. The end is not a cliff. The end is a threshold, and we cross it best by singing.